They all know where to go.
Yeah, I wonder how they got there. Hi, everyone.
The,
Uh,
the email that Comcast send, Ida, to you to
it
remind
was
you
wrong.
it's wrong. Yeah.
Okay, let me go on. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We just realized that Comcast has sent the wrong link, so I'm going to quickly send an email and fix that. We are here with the Learning Salon again, and we have Stephen Piantadosi. I'm very excited about this conversation. We will introduce him a little later. Before John starts to read a little passage from a book that he's very excited about, I am going to very briefly remind everyone that this is a space where we respect each other. We disagree intellectually strongly, but for the purpose of understanding. So disagreement is encouraged, but respect is absolutely necessary. And we have the question area below, so you can in the ask a question, add your question and vote on each other's question. Hi, Blake. And then you can also ask clarification questions throughout the talk in the chat area. And if you want to ask a question but you don't want to come on screen, just say sort of ask for me. Otherwise, we might, depending on where the flow of the conversation is, ask you to join us on screen in order to ask your question. That said, I am going to pass this on to John while I bring everybody from the other room to this one.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ida. It really is exciting to have Steve talk today. I've been wanting to sort of get to talk to him for ages, and it is a fantastic topic. You could argue almost that the title of the paper that he's going to be discussing has been the title hovering underneath almost all our Salon meetings. And I was going to actually read, Ida's allowing me to do this. I spoke to him about this. So I received in the mail today this little book, which is a symposium that was held in 1950. Okay, and it's called The Physical Basis of Mind. Okay, and this is the lineup: scientists Charles Sherrington, Lord Adrian, Russell Brain, Wilder Penfield. And what's interesting about this symposium way back in 1950 is that they had the scientists, it was like a team, and then team philosopher underneath, right? And the philosophers were Viscount Samuel, Gilbert Ryle, and A.J. Ayer. I mean, imagine, okay? And anyway, I'm going to read, because I think it's so apposite, from the opening page of the chapter 2 of this old symposium, which is called What Happens When We Think. All right. And here goes, okay? I suppose everyone who tries to understand what is going on in the brain must suffer from time to time from the feeling that this was 1950, has chosen a really insoluble problem, not merely a very difficult one. Heaven knows it is going to be difficult enough to make an intelligible picture of the workings of an organ which has millions and millions of parts and is responsible for all the complicated things we can do. But difficulties of that sort can be faced. The real trouble comes from the feeling that there may be an important part of the picture which can never be fitted in, however long we may work at it. Sherrington explained why we should have these misgivings. The part of our picture of the brain which may always be missing is, of course, the part which deals with the mind, the part which ought to explain how a particular pattern of nerve impulses can produce an idea, or the other way round, how a thought can decide which nerve cells are to come into action. It is a very old difficulty, and this comes to what you said, Stephen, when we were offline, and nowadays some of the philosophers tell us that if we look at it in the right way, it is not as serious as it seems. But the physiologist cannot look at it except as a natural scientist, and at present that seems almost certain to lead him, her, into trouble. My own feeling is that before the trouble comes to a head, it will have been solved by some enlargement of the boundaries of natural science, by the progress of psychology, for instance. In fact, psychology can scarcely get along without coming to terms with the relation of body and mind. Okay, so here's this. So I think that's fair to say, right, Steve, that here they were worrying about this link 72 years ago, with quite a lineup, and I guess it is fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that this does relate in some way to what you were worrying about in your paper, right? How do you get semantics and cognition out of subpersonal processes, right? And would you say that perhaps you would be who poor Lord Adrian would like to have stayed alive for, right? To feel that maybe the answer's closer, because I think a lot of people feel that we're not that much closer, and that could have been written, minus some of the archaic language, today, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let everybody judge how close this is. I don't think it's very close. So, you know, I feel like a lot of what's been happening is people have been either struggling for the right kind of metaphor or just wondering what the right kind of metaphor could be. And so this isn't really an attempt at a solution. It's more like an attempt at trying to describe what the right kind of metaphor or kind of one way of thinking about
what the answer might potentially look like. Yeah, somewhere exactly. In this ballpark.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't know where Ida went. I think I didn't know that she physically had to move into another room to get everyone, but I guess that is how it works. But I suppose without further ado, I hope she lets me do this. You should get started.
Cool.
I didn't introduce you. Ida was going to do that, so here she is. I didn't say anything about your credentials, so maybe Ida, you can do that.
Or you can do that, because I was trying to figure some things out still in the background, if that's okay, John.
Yes. So yes, the credentials. Steve Piantadosi is at UC Berkeley, and Ev Fedorenko's told me he's fantastic, and I found out that's true, and that's all that I really know, other than this paper's extremely deep and fascinating. Sorry if I don't have anything else more knowledgeable to say about you, Stephen. Let's go.
I think you can share your screen, Stephen, and I think I pulled everyone from the other session to this one. Now we have, we have above like 110, so I think this must be everyone. But I'm going to try to go and, while you're talking, pull people from other sessions.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for the invitation to talk here. It's really a wonderful talk series and group, and so I'm super excited to be here. I'll be talking about this work that I think is really trying to get at some of these kind of foundational questions about how cognition and neuroscience relate. And you know, I think that essentially cognition and neuroscience as fields have very different vocabularies. So in cognitive science, right, we might talk about, you know, structures or programs or processes. And in neuroscience, you might talk about, you know, spikes or spike trains or action potential, different patterns, right, population codes. And it's very difficult to figure out how those two things should be related to each other, and how it is that you could take the kinds of representations and processes that people think are kind of good cognitive descriptions and ground them some way in ideas and kind of process level things from neuroscience. And so this talk is really focused on an idea that's about 100 years old from mathematical logic called church encoding. I guess if it was up to me, church encoding would be kind of on the first page of neuroscience textbooks, because it's one way of trying to take a system and use it to represent or kind of come to know about processes on some higher level of abstraction. And so I'll give a couple of examples of that. I actually wanted to start, though, by talking about some kind of high-level cognitive processes and just trying to kind of convince people that high-level cognitive processes are things which are real and kind of worth capturing and worth thinking about how they can be grounded in neuroscientific terms. And so I wanted to start actually with this very simple example. That's some work that was done by Josh Rule, who is a grad student with Josh Tenenbaum, is currently a postdoc in my lab. He has this kind of massive experiment where you give people input-output pairs of lists. And people's job is to look at the input over here on the left, and look at the output and figure out what translates the input to the output, right? So I can give you a second just to look at it and think about that. And hopefully, if you just look at a couple of these examples, right, you might think, okay, the natural kind of thing to do might be to look at them kind of lined up one-to-one, right? And so I would see that 26 somehow gets transformed into 62, 13 somehow gets transformed into 31. And now you might be noticing a pattern, right? 91 gets transformed into 19. And so after just a couple of examples of these, maybe just 2 or 3 examples, you can learn this kind of abstract transformation, which is not even that mathematically natural, right? But where I take a symbol, I take the first thing and I swap it with the second thing. And so you can come to that not through some kind of long iterated process of kind of gradient learning or something, right? You're not getting tons of data points and it's not taking you very long. At some point, it feels like you have almost a symbolic insight into what's going on there, right? And you come to this kind of more abstract knowledge about how the inputs and the outputs relate. And of course, if I'd given you other data, you would learn something else from that data. So I'll let you look at this one just for a second. This one is a little bit harder for people. Just want to check. I'm not supposed to be able to see anything, a chat or anything. No, okay. So here's the second example. This one it takes people a little bit longer in their search and often a little bit more data. But here the rule is something like, okay, I'm going to add 1 to the first element and 2 to the second element and 3 to the third element and 4 to the fourth and so on. And after a couple of examples or a little bit of time thinking, people are able to figure that out. And that rule, right, is really different than the rule for the top one, right? The top one is about swapping positions of elements, and the second rule, right, is about adding and knowing about the index, what position you are in the list. People can discover these things. Here's the third one. This one is often very hard for people. Let you think about it for a second. Most people have a lot of trouble with this, but it's basically keep the elements in the list which follow an even number. Okay. And if you gave people probably a lot of training or a lot of time, they're able to discover that. The point of this, right, is that there seems like there's a fairly rich class of possible sort of abstract representations that people are able to learn. And in fact, when you think about your abstract representation in one of these domains, it feels sort of like a high-level, computer program. It's some sort of symbolic description of how inputs and outputs relate. It's not some simple aggregation of perceptual features or something like that that's going on here. I wanted to give one other example of this. This is a pretty closely related learning experiment that I did in graduate school, where we had people learn the meaning of a word like DAXI. Okay, so I'll tell you that, there's elements in this, there's a set of elements here, and some of these things are DAXI, and your job is to figure out what makes them DAXI. Okay, so which ones in the set are DAXI? So initially when we start, of course, you're not going to know. And I'll tell you that in this set, this one was DAXI and that one was DAXI, but not the green triangle. Given that data, which in this set do you think are DAXI? So you can think about that for a second. People in our experiment will make some predictions here and then get feedback. I tell you, okay, actually in this set, they're both DAXI. And so, there's something a little bit funny going on here, because this one the green triangle was not DAXI here, but it was DAXI there. Given this data, can you generalize here? Till none of those were DAXI. And if you give people enough examples, sometimes this is enough, or sometimes they might need 10 or 15 kind of sets to go through. They can eventually learn pretty abstract rules, right? So a rule that describes this data might be something like you're DAXI if there exists another element in the set that has the same shape. Okay, and that's an abstract logical rule because it has these operators like exists, requires you to kind of look over the other elements and to check these features like shape. And people are able to construct those kinds of high-level, almost program-like representations from relatively small amounts of data like this. And in fact, in this paper, we compare different kinds of learning models and show that you can do a really good job of predicting not only people's learning curves, but the particular elements that they make mistakes on. If you model them as doing essentially statistical inference over structured kind of logical hypotheses like this. Should feel intuitive, actually, if you go through here. I think people can often kind of feel that they're thinking in these abstract logical terms, right? So you're thinking here that the concept is something like red, and so you would answer yes and no, or you're thinking the concept is like not triangles, right? And so you would answer no and no. And then as you get feedback, you can feel yourself kind of revising and thinking through different possibilities and trying to come up with other forms of representation in order to explain the data that you see. So these kinds of patterns and these kinds of, both of those are kind of large scale experimental studies where we have hundreds of people, often thousands of people tested on hundreds of different kinds of concepts. And then we try to predict their performance and their patterns of errors and things on specific items. Those kind of empirical studies have led to this kind of idea, right, that maybe human learners are like programmers. What that means is that they may compose operations in new ways in order to form some kind of generative model or some kind of theory of data that they see. I guess one area where we've looked at this the most is in number and counting. In number and counting, there's a kind of well-known developmental trajectory that kids go through where they're born not knowing how to count. And in the US, somewhere around 3 or 4 years old, they learn how to count. And you can think of their knowledge of counting as a real procedure that they really have to sort of construct at some point. And if you're going to construct a procedure, you have to build it out of procedure-y kinds of pieces, right? So you can think about this as a little Python procedure for counting how many things there are in a set. And it's built up out of little smaller pieces like not and empty and for loops and these kind of things. And so this kind of learner as programmer picture really is that young learners have access to some basic kinds of operations, and then to learn something, they have to figure out how to compose or put together those operations in order to express something more complicated, like a counting procedure. And the idea is that that's exactly what's going on in these kinds of examples, that you're bringing to this task some kind of knowledge about, say, features and sets and quantification, those kinds of basic operations. And your job as a learner is to put those operations together in order to explain this particular data pattern that you see. And when you do that, you end up building something in your head, which is a lot like a program, right? Some kind of logical representation like that. So I realized I can't actually see questions. If there are questions, could somebody interrupt or something? Is that okay?
We tend to let you finish, and then
okay.
The questions you don't get interrupted, given you don't have that much time.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just point people to this paper led by Josh Rule that we wrote recently called "The Child is Hacker," which basically says there's lots of these different domains where people have to learn structured or procedural kinds of knowledge. And one kind of good way possibly of thinking about how development works in these domains is to think about kind of metaphors from computer science. So the kinds of ways that computer scientists have of writing code and revising code might make kind of good developmental theories, and things which would allow you to build structures that you would need to understand sports or legal systems or norms and mores or art or figure out puzzles, right? All of these are kind of very highly structured procedural domains, and really developmental science needs a theory which can deal with that. But there's problems with this kind of learning as programming account, and I wanted to just highlight 2 of them. The first one is it's really not clear what we can learn without presupposing either the necessary concepts or a lot of kind of what you would need. So, for instance, in this kind of picture, you could say, well, what if infants don't know these things? It's really not obvious that infants know how to make a while loop, right? Or infants know logical operations like ands, ors, and nots. And that's actually a real puzzle, right? Because I don't think we're familiar, right, with computational systems that lack while loops or that lack ands, ors, and nots, right? What would it even mean for a computer not to have access to those? And from what basis could you possibly learn or construct those kinds of representations? That's really unclear, I think. So both sort of empirically about what infants do know, and given the empirical results, what are those things in the scope of learning, or does Boolean logic and counting and numbers and quantification and things, so those just have to be built in as kind of primitive operations in any kind of computer or not? That's the first problem. And the second problem is that all of this talk about programs is really difficult to see how you can possibly even conceptually connect that to actual brains, right? So an actual brain looks like this, right? And a program looks like that. And this is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, right? They just look like completely different kinds of objects, right? and the vocabularies we use for talking about them just seem completely different. And so the question is, right, how could this kind of thing be realized in that kind of thing? And in some sense, like what justifies cognitive science is talking about these, right? These might be good representations of behavior. We might be able to predict behavior pretty well, but if it can't eventually be grounded out in some real kind of biological neural network, then it can't really be the right answer to what's going on here. So the kind of key idea in the paper, and that I'll talk about here, is that this kind of metaphor is not quite right. This kind of program metaphor is not right because here, like when you write a program, you're essentially writing a program that is then interpreted by some other thing, right? It's interpreted by the Python interpreter, or it's interpreted by some central processing unit on your computer or something. And that act of kind of writing down a description of what something else should do is in part what feels kind of very non-biological or non-connected to not easy to connect to biology. The alternative to this is to think about representational elements which are not interpreted by some central thing, but which themselves have some kind of intrinsic dynamics. And what this amounts to, right, is learning is then building is assembling some pieces of your representation so that their intrinsic dynamics encode something else, whatever it is you're trying to represent, right? So if you're trying to learn about the structure of the seasons, spring, fall, summer, and winter, you might know that there's 4 of them and that there's a certain relationship between them. But actually, like representing that, you have to build something inside of your own head which follows that pattern, right? So that if you wanted to, you could compute counterfactuals, right? You could say what would happen after winter if we skipped a season. You could simulate, what's 7 seasons from now. You can think through that sort of circle in your head. And that means that you have some structure there which is essentially isomorphic to that structure in the real world. So anytime you're representing or thinking about something, you're building structures whose intrinsic dynamics mirror the dynamics of whatever's happening in the world. This idea is of course, closely related to lots of ideas, lots of ways that other people have thought about representation. Here's just a quote from Randy Gaustel, who just defines a mental representation as a functioning isomorphism between a set of processes in the brain and a behaviorally important aspect of the world. So that's just sort of by definition what it means to represent something, is that the relationships in your brain mirror the relationships of the structure in the world that you're trying to understand. And of course, there's lots of theories on kind of structure mapping and structure alignment by Deirdre Gentner and colleagues, thinking about how we can reason analogically across different domains by lining up different structures. The main kind of difference, I think, to this kind of work is that this is really about the kind of underlying structural representations, whereas the stuff I'll talk about is really about underlying dynamics. So it's really about mappings of dynamical systems and not just mappings of structure. This talk will attempt to go pretty quickly through some combinatory logic. And in the paper, combinatory logic is this formalism that I think provides a pretty kind of useful analogy for thinking through how you can span levels of analysis and how you can potentially learn systems like logic or number, or things which seem like they should be built into computers. And also, it potentially allows us to take these high-level cognitive kinds of concepts and translate them down into simple forms of underlying dynamics. And so I'll tell you about that. I'll just say that combinatory logic is this very old idea from mathematical logic. And I'll talk about kind of why people invented it. In fact, it was invented essentially 3 times independently by each of these people, trying to come up with kind of very simple but computationally powerful or expressive types of logical systems. Nowadays, it gets used a lot in computer science and linguistics, kind of corners of both of those fields. Although Stephen Wolfram just like a month ago came out with a 100-year anniversary book on combinators. That's kind of a really extensive review of all the different places and all the different ways in which combinatory logic and kind of associated logics have been used. For us, it's nice because it's simple. It's Turing complete, right? It means that we can express any computation, which seems to be pretty much true for people, right? We're not kind of intrinsically bounded to very simple forms of computation. And it's compositional, which means that it's essentially building up richer computations from simple pieces, right? And that's something that a lot of people have argued is a key feature of human thinking, also a key feature of human language. But I want to emphasize that nobody would think that combinatory logic is really the right answer, right? So it's not like I think you would open up a brain and find combinators in there. It's really more like it's the right kind of idea, and it's the kind of idea that I think would be useful in thinking through exactly how we can span different levels of analysis. Okay, so maybe most basically, combinatory logic is a system for composing functions. So everybody hopefully is familiar with just the idea of taking the output of one function and sending it as the input to another function, right? So here I've defined h. H is defined to be, first I do g to x, and then I take the output of g and I do f to that output. And those two things together is just what h is. We might actually take this and write it in a slightly more abstract form, in a way that actually gets rid of the x's. So if we wanted to, we could just sort of say the x's there implicitly, make the x implicit and make the composition here, meaning the fact that I'm taking this output and sending it as the input to x, explicit. And one way we could do that is we could define this new function, which is kind of a fancy function. It's a function that doesn't take, x as input. It takes other functions as input. And what C would do here is compose them, right? So C applied to P and Q would give you, and then applied to X would give you P applied to Q of X, right? So it's just a way of kind of rewriting this where the X is sort of implicitly here, and then the C is now a kind of explicit thing that composes its arguments. And this is essentially how you write things in combinatory logic, although people often write them like this, where C is just on the inside of parentheses. So this is really meant to be the same as that. This is just, of course, notation. You could do everything with different notation if you wanted to. But with this notation is kind of handy because we can write down other kinds of fancier functions if we wanted to. So here, for example, is a function j. That composes f with the composition of g and g, right? So this sort of expression is just a fancy way of writing this kind of thing. Okay, so all of this is just notation. It's just function composition, but it introduces this idea of a combinator C, right, as something which does something else to other functions. Okay, so it's somehow manipulating other functions. And in kind of actual mathematical logic, combinatory logic, people don't use the C function. Combinatory logic is basically built on a choice of kind of basis built-in functions. And I'll talk through just one really simple one, which has just two built-in functions, two built-in combinators. And as a result, they each have a kind of definition, and then there's one additional thing, and that defines the entire kind of formal logical system. One very simple basis has k. K takes two arguments, x and y, and just returns x. So you could think of this as saying like xy, k of xy just equals my value x. K is called k because it kind of builds a constant function, right? It's something which is always x no matter what y was passed in. Y is just ignored. And here's the only kind of complicated piece of this is this other combinator S. S takes three arguments, x, y, and z, and essentially composes them together. So it composes x and z, and then it composes y and z, and then it takes those two and puts them again together. This is a little bit like kind of a generalized form of composing, where if z was empty, if z was nothing, right, it would just be x, y. So it would be like S is putting together x and y, but it has this little twist that it actually applies z before it does each of them. This is probably not intuitive. I think it's not really intuitive to anybody, except maybe the kind of logicians who originally worked this out. But these two operations are sufficient to express any computation. So what that means is you can take any computer running on your, any program running on your computer, and you can translate it. There's just a deterministic algorithm that will translate it into some big structure of S's and K's, such that evaluating S's and K's through this rule takes you through the same sequence of stages as running the computer program itself does. Another way to say that is that these two things are Turing complete. They're able to express any kind of computation. And I think that's actually kind of miraculous and non-obvious, right? That there's something so simple like this, which is able to compute. Kind of going hand in hand with that, it's also true that any composition of functions you can translate into S's and K's. So that's also not so obvious, but if you built up some big algebraic expression or something out of sine and cosine and exp and log and things, you could put those together with S's and K's and never need to write down the X's. You could write down everything just as particular combinations of S's and K's. So those are the two rules. There's actually one third rule here, which is needed, which is called currying, which essentially says that if I have some structure of S's and K's, a function can always gobble up the next arguments in line. So if I had a structure like kx here, well, k needs 2 arguments and it only has 1. But currying says I can take the kind of next thing here, right, and send it inside, and then I can evaluate it. So if I was to evaluate the k rule with this kind of structure, I would bring in the y and then apply the rule and then get out x. Let me show you just what this means, just in a really simple example. With operations like plus and 1, so if we had some numbers like those, I could write down a function here and define it to be s plus k1. Okay, that's a structure of compositions of pluses and ones and combinators. And this structure turns out to be the same as this function f of x equals x plus 1. And the way to kind of see that is to apply this structure to some number. So if I said, f applied to 7, I could take this structure and apply it to 7, and then just follow these rules. So I follow the currying rule and bring the 7 inside. I follow the definition of s. I curry again, and then I followed the definition of k, and I get out this expression, which is, the argument x plus applied to the argument x and 1. If that makes sense. In other words, like the s's and the k's here essentially route around the arguments. So they tell you where 7 should be sent and kind of how to send it around to all of the different sub-expressions. And what Schonfinkel and Curry and von Neumann showed is that with their particular sets of combinator bases, you can always find an S and K structure or structure with their combinators, which shuttled around the arguments into the right places. Okay. So maybe I'll skip that, talk about that later. You might think, okay, like all we've done here is just kind of change notation, right? So that example shows you how to write a function like f of x is x plus 1 with some other operations, s's and k's. But these things like plus and 1 are still sort of standard program operations whose meaning has to be determined somehow, right? So in other words, you could look at this kind of blue code again and say, okay, well, maybe I could get rid of some of these pieces, but it's still essentially going to be some programming code, right? I'm just like changing the primitives that I have, and that might simplify or complicate certain kinds of programs. What exactly has been gained here? And the answer is, in this case, is probably not much, but actually there's a very nearby, closely related case where you can gain a lot, and that's what you should think of as the miracle, which is that pure combinatory logic allows you to do these kinds of computations without anything other than S's and K's. Okay, and what that means is that I can define in combinatory logic sort of what 1 means and what plus means, and if I define those in the right way, then just following through with these S's and K's will give me something which performs a computation which is isomorphic to, say, adding 1, or isomorphic to whatever other kind of thing I'm interested in representing. Just to give an example of this is really going back to this thing I started with, like maybe infants don't know much about Boolean logic, okay? And if infants don't know much about Boolean logic, in what sense could they ever learn it or could they ever discover it? And again, this is not what I think is actually happening, but this is a sense in which they could, right? In which you could build a computer that doesn't know about Boolean logic. All it has is some intrinsic dynamics for things like S's and K's. And what happens when you learn Boolean logic is you learn particular structures, meaning particular mappings from these symbols like and, or, not, true, and false, such that when I map them into S and K land, the dynamics of S's and K's mirrors the same dynamics that I want out from my Boolean system. So here, for example, I could pick this mapping into these particular S and K structures. Notice there's no pluses or ones or trues or falses or anything over here. It's only S's and K's. And if I wanted to compute something, I wanted to make a prediction, for example, I could apply or to true and false. If I apply or to true and false, that means I substitute in the or expression, that's this one, with the true expression here and the false expression there, okay? And now I take this right-hand side and I let it just chug through the ordinary sequence of steps for S's and K's. And so I curry, I use S, I keep going all the way through. And if you go through all the way down with the kind of full evaluation of this, I get out this thing, right? My evaluation stops. There's nothing else I can do when I have this expression at the bottom, KK, which is true, okay? And so in other words, if I wanted to compute the value of or, true, false, I could do so using my S and K representation, right? I just allow those symbols to follow their kind of natural underlying dynamics, and I end up with something, with my internal representation of true, okay? So what S and K has allowed me to do here is build a kind of internal model of Boolean logic. And in fact, this model here is one which correctly will get all of the relations between everything, right? So not applied to true is false, not applied to false is true, and applied to true and true is true, and applied to true and false is false, and so on. So all of the kind of key Boolean relations that you want, you can write down in, all of the key Boolean relations that you want are kind of embodied in this particular S and K structure, and there's lots of other ones that could also do it. This is the kind of claimed attempt at saying what it could be like to learn something as computationally basic as and, or, and not, right? What it could be like is it could be that you have some symbols with intrinsic dynamics, that's S's and K's, and you internally have to build something which mirrors the dynamics that you want to represent, right? Here you want to represent how true, false, and, or, and not interact with each other. And to do that, you can build some particular structure out of your S's and K's that mirrors that dynamics. Okay, this process, this kind of technique is known as church encoding. That's from the title of the talk, right? This is the kind of idea, right, that I have some intrinsic dynamics and I build the right thing out of those intrinsic dynamics in order to capture some other system. So here's just a quote from a programming language book. Suppose we had a program that does some complicated computation with numbers to yield a Boolean result. What it means to church encode is that if we replace all the numbers in arithmetic operations with combinator terms representing them and then evaluate it, right, follow S's and K's dynamics, we'll get the same result. Right. Thus, in terms of their overall effect on the result of programs, there's no difference between using the actual numbers or using the church encoded numerals. That's kind of what it means for them to be representations. We've essentially developed a lab library called Chorizo to infer church encodings from simple relational information. Just to give an example here, here's an example I said before of the seasons. You might know something like there's 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall, and they have this particular successor relationship. So spring comes after winter. The successor of winter is spring. The successor of spring is summer, and so on. And what it means to form a mental representation of that domain of that kind of structure is that you find S's and K's which mirror that structure. So Chorizo will take this thing on the left, take some observations, and it will spit out things which are possible representations in whatever combinator basis you want to use, which might be S's and K's, or there's actually lots of them. There's infinitely many kind of possible ones, but there's a handful of kind of simple ones that logicians have thought a lot about. Here's another kind of structure. So some languages will count using a 1-to-many system, right? So the successor of 1 is 2, and the successor of 2 is many, and the successor of many is many. Okay, that's just like a simple little graph or something, but it's a simple little graph that you can encode into S's and K's like this. Again, these results from mathematical logic show essentially that you can encode whatever kinds of computations you want into a system like this. And And so it's not, well, yeah, I can say more about that in the discussion maybe. I'll say how Chorizo works actually, right, is that there's lots of kind of possible mappings, and what it tries to do is find a short and fast running kind of mapping. So this one is is one that assigns each of these symbols a really short representation, and when you try to check these rules, those representations will halt. They'll finish evaluating quicker than any of the other ones.
Stephen?
Yeah.
In the interest of time, I wonder whether we can kind of sort of move towards a kind of a high-level conclusion, and then you can let us know which parts you would like us to return to. And if you have any part that specifically talks about how these things go into neural networks or become biologically plausible, that would be super awesome too. But we will ask about it later. So if it's too much, we can come back to it later. Don't worry about it now. Yep.
So I'll just mention this other example really quickly, which is that like these are just about encoding, right? So they're just about they're like you're given all of the relations here, right? So you're told what the successor of each of these seasons are, and so it's not that interesting because it's just showing that you can represent something. What's more interesting is actually generalizing, and in the paper, or I'm happy to talk about later. There's lots of these other examples of things where you just get a little bit of information and then you're asked to generalize. So for instance, the structure of numbers. Kids learn the first couple number words and then they figure out pretty quickly that the kind of number concepts are unbounded and keep going on. And Chorizo does that too, right? So when it's told to encode the first couple number words, it learns an encoding which will generalize to a discrete infinity of number concepts. And there's a bunch of other domains like magnetism and dominance hierarchies and things which are in the paper where some critical piece of information is left out, and then Chorizo is asked, based on your best encoding of some partial information, how would you generalize? What would you say about this? Okay, so just to say very briefly about the neural network. So combinatory logic requires only two simple rules, and both are actually tree transformations. So if you think of these structures as kind of binary trees, K just does a transformation where I promote one of the branches below me, and S does a transformation where I duplicate one of the branches below me and then build some slightly different structure. But because of that's actually very convenient, and that's convenient because it potentially allows these to be encoded pretty directly into different neural networks. So there's this sort of longish history of coming up with neural networks which can encode tree structures, in part motivated by kind of conceptual domains and in part motivated by language. But there's things like BoltCon or Smolensky's tensor product coding, which essentially take binary or n-ary trees and show how you can encode them in neural network weights, and also how you can encode tree transformations, right? Because what it means to represent a tree is that I should be able to pick out the children and I should be able to build new trees and things. And so the fact that this has already been done, in fact, it was done in the 70s and 80s and 90s with lots of different versions, means that S and K are kind of automatically implementable in neural networks, right? So you could, in principle, just take one of those kinds of representations of trees and build in S and K directly. Figuring out how to do the learning side is a little bit more tricky, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I think kind of underlyingly why it's possible to encode S and K is that they don't depend on any kind of external, interpreter, right? They're really defining the dynamics, and then as long as you can encode those dynamics, which are just tree transformations, then you can also encode everything else that S and K can do, which is all algorithms, right? So that's what I mean about this being a kind of way of translating from high-level cognitive constructs, right? Things like algorithms and procedures, all the way down into some kind of neural representation like these. So I'm happy to say more about that. I guess the idea, right, is think how much easier it would be to implement combinatory logic, this kind of tree thing in a neural network, than to implement a full programming language, right? To implement something like Python is just really unclear, what that would even mean. But implementing very simple tree transformations seems like both possible and not so hard. Okay, so just to wrap up here, combinatory logic provides kind of language for isomorphism, where you're building representations from pieces that have simple kinds of intrinsic dynamics. And you can think of this as kind of like an assembly language for cognition. So it takes some high level thing like logic or a procedure, counting procedure, or those examples I started with. It allows you to translate them down into something where it's just kind of pieces and their interactions. Meaning arises in this kind of representation, kind of like in conceptual role theory, from the interactions between pieces. So you could say, like, what makes true mean true? Well, it's how it interacts with false and not and or. That's kind of the definition of that. That's like what it means to have meaning in a kind of church encoding. And computational primitives like number or logic don't have to be built in, right? You need something built in, but you don't need the kind of high-level cognitive pieces. Very intentionally, this kind of work kind of blurs these traditional debate lines, right? So people often argue about whether things are dynamical or symbolic or sub-symbolic. And this is actually all of those, right? It's a discrete dynamical system where the meaning of symbols, the kind of role they play, is defined almost sub-symbolically, right? So if a symbol is like true or and, its meaning, its computation is really defined by S's and K's, which are kind of sub-symbolic pieces, and the meaning and the high-level concepts really just emerge from that. I'll just say one last word about kind of directions if people are interested in discussing them. So combinatory logic was just a convenient formalism, but it's not really an ideal one. For a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk about. But there's lots of other kind of cool work on related systems. So Josh Rule in my lab has been working on term rewriting systems, which are closely related, but a little bit more general, and seem to do a pretty good job of modeling examples like the list examples I started with. There's related things like Turing complete neural networks, right, which are really trying to encode like a Turing machine as into a neural network, or trying to use a neural network as a controller for a Turing machine. And those are closely related, but slightly different, I think, in philosophy. And if anybody's interested in neural network implementations of combinators or similar formalisms, please talk to me, because that's something I would be super interested in. So I'll end with this quote by Hofstadter from the 80s, which is, I think, very much in the kind of spirit of this kind of representation. The brain itself does not manipulate symbols. The brain is a medium in which the symbols are floating and in which they trigger each other. There's no central manipulator, no central program. We feel those symbols churning within ourselves in somewhat the same way as we feel our stomach churning. We do not do symbol manipulation by some sort of active will, let alone some set of logical rules of deduction. We cannot decide what we will think next, nor how our thoughts will progress. Not only are we not symbol manipulators, in fact, quite the opposite, we're manipulated by our symbols, right? So that's like symbols are getting their dynamics, and they're acting on each other, much like in this kind of church encoding sense. Okay, I'll end there. I'll just thank the kind of main collaborators on this, Josh Rule, Josh Tannenbaum on related work, and Yim Register on some experimental work relating to combinators.
Thank you so much. John is frozen, but I'm sure behind that frozen screen, he's clapping.
I'm here. Can you hear me at least?
I can hear you, but you're still frozen for me. I don't know if for others it's the same.
Am I frozen?
Yeah, for me you are.
Oh yeah, your picture's frozen.
Well, I'll just speak.
Yeah. John, why don't you turn your camera off and on? Oh no. Oh, he's gonna come back. He didn't leave. Good.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but do you want to turn your camera on again just so we see you?
How do I do that?
If you scroll, there is a camera icon and your camera is off. I can turn it on for you if you want.
Yeah. I don't have it.
I turned it on for you. Okay, you're back. Perfect.
Am I moving?
So thank you so much, Stephen. We have already 13 questions. There were a lot of questions in the chat as you were discussing that we were kind of having conversation there. I have a bunch of questions, but I guess I will give the floor to John, although John, you're frozen again, so I'm a little worried. Is there any way you can get a better connection right now?
Well, I don't have to be on the camera, right?
I think for everyone, it would be.
Put me back on the camera again.
I will put you back on the camera.
Put it back on.
Your quality is low. Is there anywhere else in your home that has better internet?
Oh, it was fine. So you always make me feel so inadequate with my Wi-Fi.
It's not you. It's the Wi-Fi.
Okay. I'm moving. All right.
Yes.
Can you still see me? Okay. All right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Should we talk?
You go ahead first, as long as we have your good Wi-Fi.
Okay, Stephen, this is one of those Necker cube-like talks, and your paper was the same thing. There are moments when you think, yes, this really, I get it. And then there are other moments where it feels just too good to be true, right? So I'm just trying to understand the difference between these subpersonal systems whose internal dynamics offers up these symbols that we explicitly talk about. In other words, when you were showing your talk, you had your K's and S's on the right of the equation, and then you had the other way of talking about it to the left of your equation, right? But we listening to you can see both, right? So where does the explicit representation come from that we then operate on after all this implicit dynamics has gone on? Right?
Yeah.
Because I can't decide whether you're making an implementational argument for how we have symbols that then we think we explicitly manipulate, which surely we do, right? In other words, when, Andrew Wiles sat down and worked out Fermat's last theorem, it would be very odd to suggest that he wasn't explicitly manipulating symbols in his derivations. So where does the divide between the implicit to the explicit happen in your system?
Yeah, I think it's not capturing the explicit symbol manipulation that people do, right? So,
but that's what thinking is.
Well, maybe
right?
It might be, right? It depends on whether there's implicit symbols driving your explicit symbol manipulation or not, right? So. I guess I.
But you see my problem. What am I missing? What am I missing?
Well, I guess I think of it as it's mainly a theory of how you represent some process you see in the world, right? And Andrew Wiles might or might not be representing some process he sees in the world when he's explicitly manipulating symbols or going through some math proof or something like that, right? I think there are cases in which you are, right? I think that's kind of like if we followed through and evaluated Boolean logic or something, if I gave you a logical expression, you might explicitly be kind of chugging along and doing that. But it's different than like inventing something, for instance. Like I think if you do a math proof, you often have to invent something new. And this isn't a theory of how you invent something new. It's a theory of just how you represent some dynamics that you observe out in the world. And so maybe that question of like,
but could you give, I see, but could you give a more, it's difficult when the representations that you talked about in your talk were mathematical functions. Could you give a more, just so again, you see where I'm coming from. When it comes to Fermat's last theorem and the discussion we're having now on Zoom, it's very human, explicit, symbolic, language, meaning saturated. But does your account work in a mouse?
I have no idea.
But where is the difference between this that we're doing now and what mice do? And I'm not being anti-mouse, God forbid, with this audience, I'll get into huge trouble. But all I'm saying is I'm trying to understand, the kind of explicit symbolic thought that's going on right now in this discussion, I hope, more on your part than mine probably, and Fermat's last theorem as a derivation, and all the implicit behaviors that we and other animals engage in. Is this account, for which one of those two kinds of behavior is this an account of?
Yeah, so I guess one answer to the mouse question would be to say that humans are probably Turing complete in a a real sense, right? Like we can learn, just a huge variety of different computational processes and learn to think about them, right? And that's probably not true of mice. So this is meant to.
But couldn't mice just? But why don't mice have K and S? If you just need rules, 2 rules, then why doesn't every animal on Earth have 2 rules?
Well, you need 2 rules, and you need structure building, and you need the ability to search over what K's and S's will form a good kind of explanatory theory of the stuff that you see out in the world. And
so we need something. So we need something else from the. But I thought the whole point of your treatment was that if you had an X inside the function, somebody had to look at the X and place it. You then say we can get rid of that with this combinator approach and just have it sort of subpersonally arise. But now you're telling me that in addition to having K and S, you have to have some external person evaluating how to put K and S together, which means we're right back where we started.
No, sorry. It's not an external person evaluating it. So like in Chorizo, in the implementation, right, it'll take some observed relations in the world, like, 3 is the successor of 2 and 2 is the successor of 1. And it searches, you could think internally, to find S and K structures which mirror those relations. And then once it finds those, it's able to use them to derive new facts, like is the successor of 3, is that the same as 1 or not, right? And you can answer those questions kind of by mental simulation, by using your S and K structures for those and running them forwards and deriving kind of new facts from them. So it doesn't take anything external.
But it has to match. I mean, how do you know that your K and S combination matches initially is a successful match? Who determines that that's a correct match to begin with?
Yeah, so that's assumed to be,
so in other words,
part of the learning process, right? So like in Chorizo, you have, I guess you have one other kind of representational format which is different than the S's and K's, which is some representation of how the symbols should relate to each other, right? That when I apply successor to 1, I end up with 2, whatever those symbols are. And when I apply successor of 2, I end up with 3. And so I have to know that. That's in fact something that kids learn about number very early. But once I know those relations, then I search for an encoding which matches those relations.
But how do I know that? But how do I get that first bit?
Well, in the case of number, you might get it explicitly, or you might get it through kind of counting, observing people count and observing how people use numbers, right? In other cases, I don't know.
But is that separate from? But is that separate from then going on to doing church encoding?
Yeah. So that's in some sense telling me what about the world I have to represent, right? And that part is really important because that's what tells me that in my church encoding, I should be encoding numbers and not Boolean logic or not seasons or some other thing, right? So I have to have some way of taking my internal.
But isn't that some kind of knowledge that you have to get the whole thing going?
Yeah. So I have to have some kind of facts about the world that I'm trying to represent. That's right. And I think it's fair to say, well, what is the representational format for those facts? In Chorizo, it's just these simple.
What is the representational format?
Yeah.
But what is the representational format for those facts?
Well, so in Chorizo, it's just these simple kind of relational statements, right? Like there is a symbol successor and there is a symbol 1, and the successor of 1 is 2. Okay. Now you take that and you trick your internal dynamics into coming up with mappings for successor 1 and 2, which match that. And so you have to have represented that or, observed it in the world or something. And then you have to, search through S and K structures in order to find something which mirrors that relation. And so in all of those Chorizo examples, right, that's why there's 2 things there. The left-hand side is the relations that are the kind of defining relations for whatever domain we're looking at. And the right-hand side is the encoding of it. And all Chorizo does is it takes the left-hand side, it takes the defining relations, and it finds encodings which match those relations. And it tries to find, short, fast-running ones. And those short, fast-running ones tend to be good ones for generalizing. So
I'll finish I still don't, and I absolutely mean this sincerely, I may just be being slow, but I just don't understand if you want to start getting into chorizo, which is a great name, by the way,
Thanks.
And you want to now get that relation turned into these KNSs, I still don't understand how that doesn't presuppose the relation before you get the ball rolling and turning it into church encoding. How do you know what's the brain process that can't itself be talked about in terms of KNSs that happens before you start going into KNSs? I'm missing the initiating event.
Yeah, so you could think of it as like you look at the world and you parse it into symbols. Okay, so you say like, oh, there's some symbol for one, whatever that means, and there's some symbol for successor or moving to the next thing, and there's some symbol for two. And those are things I learned from the world, right? People use words 1 and 2. Those are good candidates for having symbols. I see people counting. That's a good candidate for wanting a kind of successor symbol. But it's not enough just to know those, right? Because you know more about 1, 2. You know more about 1 and 2 and successor than just that 2 is the successor of 1, right? You also can keep applying the successor function arbitrarily long, right? You can keep counting up conceptually as high as you want to. There's no kind of upper bound to it. You can go far beyond any number that you've ever seen before. And that means that successor counting or whatever has some intrinsic dynamics. And that means that we need a kind of representational theory for how you would discover that dynamics and what would kind of cash it out. What would define it as you continue counting higher than you've seen before. If that makes sense. So it's not like I think maybe what's at the heart of your question is like it's not just S and K. It's both S and K and an ability to recognize some symbolic pieces that are useful for describing what you're seeing in the world, right? And or not is the same way, right? Like in order to learn that, I have to know at least some of the kind of defining relations. And you could take chorizo and include or not include, various defining relations and see how it will learn and generalize. But it could be that, not applied to true was true and not applied to false was true, right? That's like a possible symbolic meaning for not. And so any learner is going to have to essentially memorize that, right? You're going to have to like just see that out in the world. And, maybe even be explicitly taught that in order to learn that relation. So some of them like just have to be memorized in some sense, and then it's just an encoding theory, and others can be derived, right? So, I can ask you whether the successor of a quadrillion is 1 or not, right? And you can derive that through what you know about successors. That makes sense.
Yeah, it just feels like what you've described is a way to take, just like Fodor believed that there had to be some semantic primitives, and even in the original McCullough and Pitts paper, right, it was very interesting that they almost made each neuron be a logic gate, right? And of course, that was the road that ended up not being taken by the Connectionist project. But they had, these psychons, these primitives. And I thought your whole framework was to try and get rid of the need for any semantic primitives to get the ball rolling, that you got them somehow for free from a subpersonal process. But now listening to you, your story sounds more like, yes, you do need some kind of ability to carve up the world into symbols and be able to do that. And then you can proceduralize it with your dynamics, but it's almost like a proceduralization story rather than the origins of the original semantic relations.
No, so I think in what you just said is almost right, except that it's confusing making symbols with getting their semantics. So I guess I think of it as you need some way to symbolically parse the world, right? You have to have parsed it into 4 seasons and the successor relation, okay? And then once you do that, all you have are symbols, right? You just have like empty pointers or something, right? That just point to some aspect of the world. And the semantics are what are defined by S's and K's, right? So the semantics of successor among the seasons is defined by how the spring S and K structure interacts with the successor S and K structure. So S's and K's give you the semantics, but you need a kind of symbolic parse, at least for chorizo to work.
So, John, are you almost done?
No, I am. I'm just trying to work
All
it
right.
out.
So
I mean,
there are 16 questions.
that's really, it's very interesting.
So I'm going to like kind of try to gradually start to sort of ask my question and move to other questions, and so that we can kind of have some time. So Stephen, the highest voted question was mine, so I'm going to ask my question first, but I'm going to invite also Blake on screen, who has the next highest voted question. And hopefully he's going to join us. And I saw that Zena and Montreal had related questions. So if you want to join the screen, please write in the chat so I can invite you. Hi, Blake. So I'm going to mute you for a second because you had an echo. All right. So here's my question for you, Stephen. It's a threefold maybe question. So I'm going to ask it slowly. Hopefully it'll take me less time than for John. So I'm struggling a little bit, even though I'm enthusiastic, to see how this church encoding can help us, if at all, to understand like kind of how brains implement reasoning or whatnot, human brains especially, and whether how it can help us have a biologically plausible implementation of said reasoning in neural networks or other plausible learning approaches. Since we're in the Learning Salon, and the Learning Salon is committed to discussing contentions and bridges between biological and artificial learning. And as we all know, there is, I guess at this point, 70-year-old rift in the field of cognitive science that like goes up and down between kind of the connectionists and kind of like more symbolic approaches. There have been obviously approaches to bring the two together, non-satisfactory in my opinion yet. So what do you think is how do we reach a biologically plausible realization of this in learning? And also, where in the brain are these rules or representations you're talking about? And basically, do we inherit these rules? Do we learn them? And the reason I ask is you give the example of counting a lot. There are some tribes, for instance, that they only count for 1, 2, and many, but when they took the kids of those tribes and taught them how to count, the kids could learn. And that, you know, corresponded to certain kind of notions that people realize, okay, counting is not entirely kind of given. You have to learn it. But it seems like they had the ability, but they didn't need to develop it for some reason. So what do you think is happening? What's the representation and rules looking like in the brain? What is learned? What is innate? What exactly do you think is going on?
Yeah, that's complicated. So I have to say I don't know much about the brain. So you know, I don't think I even would have good kind of hypotheses about where you could find these things. I think the claim is about the sort of nature of things one should look for, right? And what one should look for in order to explain you know, our abilities to manage structures and algorithms and processes and things across all of these different domains is something like this, right? That has like simple kind of underlying dynamics, but is still Turing complete, and which allows you to build kind of arbitrary new symbol systems. And I think that piece of simple components which allow you to build arbitrary symbolic representations, that's like what church encoding does. And it's, I guess, related to these questions of learning, right? I think that like the claim is not that any of the kind of SNK structures one like chorizo would learn are innate, right? The claim is that what's innate is an ability to discover those things. And so if you're in a culture that, you know, has a one-to-many system, then you'll discover and learn that one. And if you're in a culture that has counting, you'll discover that one. And if you are in a culture that counts by twos, you'll discover that one, right? And so I think that this is actually kind of underweighted in like developmental psychology and probably in neuroscience is our ability to learn really arbitrarily, you know, pretty complicated structures. I think that we're not highly constrained, say innately to only learn certain particular classes of computations, but we're really able to learn a very broad kind of class. And so that means there has to be a kind of neural substrate which allows you to learn a broad class. And it's part of this kind of miraculous feature, I think, of things like combinatory logic that there end up being very simple computational systems which are Turing complete. And I guess, I don't know, philosophically or something, it doesn't seem like that has to be true, right? It seemed like it could have been a kind of universe where in order to express, most computations, you needed something really kind of complicated. And it's pretty striking, I think, that there are, these very, very simple systems like combinatory logic, but there's also others. I mean, there's cellular automata. There's things which have very simple rules, but nonetheless allow you to build arbitrarily complicated structures.
If I may say something, so I am fully in agreement that the brain has, and this is something I've discussed at this Salon for a while, and especially with John and Hessam also recently, which is that I do think the brain, human brain especially, has this kind of circuitry that allows for multiple algorithms or computations to be kind of learned on it, which might be, that's the quantitative difference between humans and other animals that makes humans like more able, is that the circuitry somehow allows for more number of algorithms, but not just like a little bit more, just like a lot more algorithms in a kind of a generative way. So I'm there with you until then. But whether that means that what we have in the brain is the form of a cellular...
I think the audio dropped out. Is that just me?
I mean, do others hear me? Others are nodding. They can hear me. Okay. Others can hear me. Steven. Oh, he's trying to reconnect. I think he just got disconnected. Well, just when I was going somewhere. Let's see where he is. Okay. I will re-invite him once I see him again here. Okay.
Everyone, we're not being honest. We just got rid of him. Right, Ida?
I mean, John, we can't really see you because you're still frozen, but you would think after 2 years of a pandemic.
But they heard me.
They did hear you. I'm just going to turn your cam. Oh, you're back. You're momentarily back and then you disappear again. All right, let's see if Steven is back. It says accepted and connecting. Maybe oh, is he back? Yes.
Hello.
Hi, you're back. All right. So do you hear me now?
Yep. Sorry.
Perfect. Okay. So, all right. So I agree with you that there would be some kind of a more general circuitry that allows for multiple algorithms. I don't see if anyone has shown that has the format of the cellular automata, or I don't know how you jump from there to church language. So let's fill in the gap. Let's fill in the gap in between. How would this empower a neural network to do reasoning? How would these things be represented, even in a neural network, if you don't like brains or if you don't care about brains? And then we will think about the steps that will go from there, the neural network, to brain. You can mention other learning approaches where we are not just doing logic or symbolic processing just from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
So if you could give something in that direction, how is this learnable or implementable in a neural network?
Yeah, well, so learnable, I think, is easier. Sorry, implementable is easier than learnable. And it's implementable in the same sense that like binary trees are implementable. So these, tensor product coding or boltzcons, or I think there's a dozen different ways that people have thought about getting kind of tree structures into neural networks. And once you have a tree structure, then S and K, for example, are just transformations of the tree. So K is promotion of one of the children, and S is kind of a reconfiguring of a couple of the nodes. And again, I'm not saying that those are the kind of right thing, but they're simple to do, right? They're given tree representations and kind of tree manipulations that people have already worked out for neural networks. Those are things that you could just kind of directly encode. And once you have those, right, then you could do Boolean logic, for example, right? You could write down the particular S and K structures as activation patterns corresponding to trees, right? And then if you wanted to, compose or true false, right, you could do that sort of tree composition in your whichever of those representational frameworks.
How does it learn what constellation of tree is for true or false or another statement, or how does it learn that?
Yeah, so this is what I was saying, that the learning side I think is not something I've worked out, right? Or I think anybody has worked out, but it's at least plausible given the representational side, right? Which is like, okay, once we have things which can mirror S and K's kind of tree dynamics, which are essentially already there, then essentially we're just searching over those in some way. Yeah, I mean, I think that's mainly a kind of experimental neural network question or something, like what would happen if you tried to do gradient ascent on, tree-like representations or something, right? Or I think actually probably the more plausible case is cellular automata, right? There you can have very simple kind of local interaction rules, get out something which is Turing complete, and do kind of analogs of church encoding of various structures and computational processes. There it seems pretty plausible that kind of local update rules and local error correction or something would learn there. But it's not something I've done, right? So it's not. I don't know.
So even though you haven't done it, let me push back a little bit on what you were describing, because it seems like you were describing an engineering solution. And what I was asking was basically directed at what kind of neural networks that would eventually say something about the brain, right? So let me rephrase that. What does the church encoding tell us about how the brain does symbolic processing?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing it tells you is that you can believe that people have these abstract program-like logical representations without thinking that you'll ever exactly find those in the brain. Like I don't even know what it would mean to find, the counting algorithm or something. And so thinking through this kind of translation of translating an algorithm into, underlying dynamics, what it tells you is that you should be looking for things where the underlying dynamics is composable in a way that allows you to express arbitrary relations, for example. I don't know, like anatomically or on a systems neuroscience level or something, what exactly that would mean, right? But it's meant to, like, hopefully you could squint at it and see that it's not so incompatible to think that there's some underlying dynamics which implement a high level kind of cognitive theory like these.
So yeah, that's what we all work on and work towards. And in fact, Blake and I have this work that we're doing on contextual memory trees. So we do think about these kinds of things often. But I wonder whether, for what you said, if our goal is to understand the brain and how the brain does these things, do we need church encoding, or can we do it just by looking for algorithms that enable compositionality and learn various rules for various compositional arrangements?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think doing that might be finding church encoding. I don't know. I think that the usefulness of the kind of church encoding idea is just to say that there's some intrinsic dynamics, and you trick that intrinsic dynamics into doing something else, right? Into representing the seasons or whatever, right? And that's the kind of metaphor that lets you go from whatever the hell the brain dynamics are all the way up to whatever the high level structures are. Like church encoding lets you talk simultaneously about how S and K interact with each other and about how successor on numbers work or whatever, right? Because it implements successors on numbers using the intrinsic dynamics of S's and K's. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So I give the floor to Blake and then Hessam, and anyone else who is interested in joining the screen, please mention in the chat.
There we go. Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. So my question is kind of related to Ida's stuff, but I'm gonna couch it slightly differently and ask a fairly concrete version of the question I posted on the Q&A. So the fact that you can get this Turing complete language from these two operators is cool. It's elegant. But is there any reason to think that these two operators are really the two that well describe what's happening in the brain? given that there are other Turing-complete ways of describing many different systems, other Turing-complete models, some of which arguably might more closely align to our understanding of how the brain operates, I was struggling to see throughout your talk why we should view this combinatorial logic approach as the right approach to modeling the brain. We could just open it up and say, that S and K aren't the only operators. There's many other operators. Or alternatively, we could use a totally different approach. And in both cases, we could achieve Turing completeness and algorithmic descriptions and all that kind of stuff. So let me maybe put it this way. Is the desire to kind of operate with this very reduced set of operations not driven in part by an aesthetics as opposed to any empirical evidence?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's any empirical evidence at all that's right. I don't even think it's right? I just think it's kind of a useful metaphor here. I would say, though, that there's a gazillion different kind of Turing-complete formalisms, and it's probably worth thinking about what properties are good for them. So, for example, one thing that's nice about combinators, not S and K in particular, but any combinatory logic like that, is that it's compositional, right? And that's why it gets used in for instance, linguistics and linguistic semantics, is that, a lot of how we think is language and compositional structures in language, and combinators end up being very convenient for that. And so, if you think about what metaphor should we be looking for in the brain, right? I would argue it's probably not Turing machines, right?
Sure, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
And it may not be cellular automata. I don't know. I mean, it depends on kind of how compositional cellular automata could be made to be, and I don't know about that. But so I think one can think through the different classes of Turing complete systems, right, and try to find some that might look plausible. And that's entirely just a kind of plausibility thing, right? So I think it's plausible that it's something kind of compositional, but I don't know, maybe there's 1,000 innate combinators, right? And that would probably simplify a lot of different things, right? And it might simplify execution and representation in a way that's different than just having just having S and K. So it's really not meant to be a kind of serious proposal about what is actually the representation. It's meant to be a kind of demonstration of how one can think about spanning different levels of analysis like this. And in some sense, trying to kind of pinpoint what is non-neuroscientific about the high-level logical theories, right? People coming up with programs or thinking about these logical relations and things. I think what's hard about those is that those symbols don't have intrinsic dynamics. And so, great, combinators is one kind of system that does have intrinsic dynamics, but there's probably 1,000 others, right?
Okay, thanks. Yep, that addresses my question. I would have follow-ups, but I think it's best to let it go to the next person.
Cool.
Stay online though, because stay on screen. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Stephen. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm super excited about this stuff. So I've kind of been thinking about how one can possibly imagine a neural implementation of combinatory logic, and something that strikes me as probably the most challenging aspect of it is that some combinators generate symbols. So they create new nodes in that tree structure that you're trying to represent. And if you're representing your tree as in like the conventional way that people do it, you have some neuron that represents some symbol. I think this is how the Smolensky method does it. Then it's hard to imagine how you can generate new symbols without expanding your neural network. So for example, the cellular automata models that you can imagine, they have a feature where the neural pattern is translationally invariant. You can just imagine it like moving, and then it wouldn't matter where it starts. The progression of that pattern is determined by just how the pattern looks like, not where it is in the network. But the unless you have some system like that, it's hard for me to imagine that you can implement the S combinator or any of the other combinators that duplicate terms. Do you have any ideas on that? Like what's the solution to that, or is that some area of active research?
Yeah, so I don't remember the Smolenski stuff well enough. Although I do remember that there's a cons operator there, which is like taking two things and putting them together in a list. And so that may or may not do enough, because it, to do S, you also have to duplicate, right? So you have to copy Z over, and I'm not sure how that thing handles copying. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody here that knows a lot about encoding binary trees in neural networks. But I feel like I don't know enough about it. I will say though that like there's some capacity limit, of course, right? So, I think that it seems plausible to me that you can use those kinds of Smolensky methods up until whatever the capacity limit is, essentially. And so it's not like you have to like always be able to add stuff, because of course there's like people will just run out of capacity at some point. And I'm not sure how that interacts with the kind of coding schemes that people have thought about. But.
David Linden.
Lots of fun and a little bit bewildering for a molecular neurobiologist here. So what I'm trying to think about, and I think what a lot of the people on my end of things are trying to think about, is what does this concept of church encoding and the combinatory logic get us when we already know that some of these logical operations exist in single neurons? Right? In other words, we already know how a synapse does and. We already know how a small network does or exclusive or. That's not a mystery. We've got it cellularly. We've got it molecularly. We know that there are receptors that require coincidence to be activated. We know that there's shunting inhibition that can veto something more distal. We have mechanisms for this already, well defined at a molecular level. We know how you can have an analogy encoded into a single receptor that is bifunctional, that transduces, for example, chili pepper spice and heat. And so there's representation analogy already built in there, right? So if these things are there at such a basic level, molecularly defined, cellularly defined, what is gained by this formalism to break it down further?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what's gained is that even though those things are there on a cellular level, they're not there on a cognitive level, right? So if you take a newborn kid and try to get them to compute with ands, ors, and nots, you give them behavioral tasks where they would have to use ands, ors, and nots, right? Or you give them counting tasks with number, or you ask them to do some form of reasoning, right? They can't do those things. So it's not like having and or not at a cellular level allows you to have it at a cognitive level, and that's interesting.
A baby can do associative eyelid conditioning.
So
that's an and computation.
Yeah, so there's some you can do. You can do like conditioning experiments like that. People have also done like disjunctive syllogisms or different forms of syllogistic reasoning with kids. Work in, for example, Susan Carey's lab over the past couple of years has been trying to do this. Other people have been trying to figure out things like negation, and it looks like they're just not very good at many of those. And they're definitely not good at counting. So there's sort of abstract versions of these things which may exist on a cellular level, but which aren't behaviorally accessible or something.
Well, I mean, they're behaviorally accessible if you make the behavior simple enough, right? In other words, counting is a higher level thing than aversion learning or associative eyelid conditioning, which a young baby can do, right? You don't need counting to be your test.
Well, but you do learn counting. So I mean, it might be that you could say, okay, maybe innately you have conjunction and disjunction or some negation, right? Like maybe those actually are innate and you don't need combinatory logic for them. But there's still 1,000 other things an adult learns, right? There's 1,000 other kinds of structures and processes like counting, or like learning to repair cars, or like learning your kinship tree, right? That are real sort of genuine cognitive structures that infants definitely don't have. So you need some other kind of representational format in order to make sense of those kind of cognitive phenomena.
But to be clear, just to jump in on this, so those of us who work on like hierarchical associative learning in the brain and whatnot, those are the kinds of things that we are trying to figure out how the brain learns, and via representation learning in the way that, you know, there is actual learning and encoding in neurons involved in there. Which I guess like Blake and I belong to that tradition. So I think that's where our kind of questions came from. And I think that has a potentially closer link to the molecular level at some point, because it's still a functionalist and computational approach, but we do have implementation in mind, and we do study it in biological creatures, both in humans and in rodents. And it's interesting, like, you know, some of the underlying machinery exists earlier, but for a particular level of complexity onwards, then it seems like that machinery might not be sufficient. And like, you know, in Comp Neuro, there is a disagreement from people who think, no, it's rodents all the way down. And those of us who think something, you know, something might be at least circuits-wise allowing for more algorithms in the human, to John, who thinks it's all symbolic for humans, for instance, or at least thought is explicit symbolic manipulation, which is conscious. So there's like this spectrum of different ways of thinking about it. And I think it's great to have David Linden and Hessam on this call, because I know Hessam has some molecular ideas and David has this molecular perspective. So we have a very diverse set of people right now in terms of theoretical and empirical approaches. What do you think, like, realistically, which approach is more likely to lead to the molecular one? And how do you think our approach can maybe learn something from yours in that would work for us? Not that we are going to implement logic now in a rodent brain, right? But what do you think can be learned so that what David was saying can be merged? Or what can be learned for the logic? Can we think about how a particular church encoding might be encoded in like, you know, actual neurons, and not just a neural network, but actual biology? So both ways. Do you have an idea? I think somebody asked in the chat, in the questions, about the bridge between the different fields.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mainly looking for things at whatever level in neurons. I mean, maybe it's molecular, maybe it's network level properties or something, right? It's looking for Turing completeness, I think, is the kind of main claim. I mean, that's part of why I started with that example of the kind of list reasoning, right? Where a couple of examples, you can come up with the abstract concept that you've never seen before, right? And you can discover it from, you know, 5 or 6 kind of observations of those kind of simple sequences. You know, I think that is you know, underappreciated. I mean, I'm sort of most familiar with it being underappreciated in cognitive development, right? Where, you know, people often talk about kind of learning processes for very simple domains, you know, that could, you know, how do you learn like one particular area? And the issue is, right, that like people learn 1,000 different areas, and when we learn 1,000 different areas, and each of them we're very good at dealing with novel structures, of internalizing novel structures, and then reasoning about those novel structures that we've internalized. So, you know, I think that generality is really hard to figure out, both on the representational end and on the inference end. Right, like how is it that you could take those 5 examples and in a couple of seconds figure out this sort of abstract logical rule? Yeah.
So can I just to sort of try and synthesize what's being said here, because there are so many things that you tried to do with this great paper, right? And one is, you know, to try and do the mapping that everyone's asking for by saying that this church encoding could be imagined, whether Hassan believes it's a level of inside cells or at the level of the network, but nevertheless, that there's some dynamical representational dynamics. It's possible that somehow we can neurally implement the church encoding, right? And then, of course, the church encoding is really interesting for the reasons that we got into it over. But then Hassan asked a really interesting question about sort of additional symbols and nodes. So just so I understand, what Blake and I always argue about is he says, no, the meaning is now in the relations, it's not in the symbol, okay? So I just want to ratchet this once just so I understand it, okay? So let's not talk about seasons, let's say family relations, okay? So you've got 4 people, and this is the mother, this is the father, this is the son is a sibling to the sister and all that, okay? So if I understand it, you have father, mother, son, daughter. Now, those words already seem to have relations in them, or you'd have to have symbols, and now the notion of the relation that makes it a father, a mother, a daughter, or a son comes out at your church encoding level, where the meaning of those relations isn't in the initial symbols. So we wouldn't call them father, mother, daughter, son. You'd call them A, B, C, and D, right? And then you'd somehow learn the relations between them. And by learning the relations between them in the church encoding, then you understand father, mother, daughter, son. But at that point, they then take on symbolic use that they then could then in a next ratchet be put into a system. So if you're watching Game of Thrones, now you go, okay, we've got that family, and now they're warring with another family, right? And that relation is now one of feud, and that gets ratcheted into your system. But the problem I'm having is that at each turn of the ratchet, you've got symbols that you feed in that have lots of meaning in them before you get to the relation stage, right? So how do those symbols that already have meaning that then can have meta relations between them to go through your thing? But at that point, you fed in a symbol that already has meaning before you turn the ratchet again. So I don't understand the point that symbols don't have meanings, only relations have meanings.
Yeah, so I think
do you see what I'm saying?
I think it's a fair worry to say, like, okay, once you have the relational information, that's everything you need in some of these domains, right? So like once you know who's whose father and who's whose daughter and whatever in the kinship domain, that's pretty much all there is to know about it. And you don't really maybe need to encode those things into combinatory logic, right? If you had the relations as representations. And that kind of way of thinking, I think, is pretty reasonable. And actually, Josh Rule, one of the people who's been involved in this, has essentially a different version of this kind of learning system where you don't encode things into combinatory logic. You encode them into essentially a rewrite system. Which you can think of as a little bit like learning kind of a prologue like representation or something, right? It's one where the relations are the explicit things that you know. And then often those relations and kind of rules stated over those relations will allow you to do reasoning in the other cases where you don't have kind of exhaustive information about all of the relationships between everybody. So there's sort of families of different kinds of compositional systems like this, which probably in some sense will make different empirical predictions on behavioral tasks and things, but it's not something that we've gotten very far with there. But yeah, I think that's a good intuition, which is that sometimes it feels like we're like sometimes just knowing the relations, who is the father of who, is like all that you need to know. And you may not gain much by encoding that in some other, by church encoding that in some other system. Where you do gain stuff from church encoding is when you have to reason about relations you haven't seen before, right? So if I wanted to represent, grandfather, and I had learned grandfather on my family tree, I then go to apply it to your family tree and ask who your grandfather was, right? Like if all I had was a big list of relations, I wouldn't be able to compute that. What I need is some kind of operation or some kind of algorithm that operates on the tree itself, right? And that then makes it sort of more procedural, and then that's the kind of thing that you might think about church encoding.
Right, but that gets to the point that I tried to make, half an hour ago, which is I kind of get it when you can sort of almost implicitly proceduralize an operation that can allow you to do the kind of generalization you're saying. But I guess it just seems to me that so much of what we work on before we start doing that are all these facts and relations that we already have before we feed into your system. And it just seems to me that so much of what I thought we would want to know about, I remember Tim Behrens being on once and saying, it's really difficult to know how we encode facts, right? These things that we start with. And it seems to me that in the end, the way you're speaking is that your whole system is downstream of the facts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it takes some factual symbolic parse and then lets you generalize. I think that's the hard part, because I mean, aside from how you represent facts, which I agree is a hard and interesting problem, like facts are just things that you memorize, right? And so stuff that you're really reasoning about, that's more of a process, right? Where I'm taking the facts I know and I'm trying to derive some kind of new information. And this is meant to be an attempt to say, like, okay, how do you derive new information from stuff, right? You let's give some symbols, some dynamics, and find kind of concise church encodings of things, so that when I put my symbols together in a new way, when I compute the successor of a gazillion, right, I'm still able to do that. It's not like I'm totally incapable of thinking about that because I've never encountered the successor of a gazillion before.
Yeah, I'll just finish by saying, it's very similar to what Ida and I, when we had Zena on, and Zena was talking about sort of the mechanics of inference in a probabilistic framework, and there's no question that you can turn that crank, right, do the Bayesian reasoning, the inference, but you still would like to know where you get the explicit things to plonk into those equations in the first place.
Yes, I agree.
Right. In other words, there's the mechanic, and I think representation for us, and I don't want to speak for Ida, was it's the thing that you operate on, right? And I think you're giving more of a operational view that has some grounding in neuroscience ultimately because of the dynamical systems view. But we still need to get those facts into the system to start turning the crank, whether it's probabilistic Bayesian inference or whether it's what you're showing. And I still feel like we want the upstream generation of the fact that needs to be put into the system remains a little bit of a mystery.
No, I agree. Yeah. So what's not
like, sorry to jump in, but like, I first of all disagree with that. And facts being stored in the brain is not the biggest mystery, etc. But I just want to come back to the issue of the family tree. To say that, so Tim Behrens' paper with James Whittington as the first author, the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, in fact, uses this, which I pasted in the chat, is one of those cases where we have this situation where it learns how to sort of parse a family tree, but it cannot understand a family that might have 5 kids instead of 2 kids. Like it gets kind of restrained. It can't generalize that far. And so it's interesting, but their approach, unlike yours, it's it's a learning approach, like somewhere in between in a manner of speaking, but it's just matrix manipulation. So it's a little closer to my world and to the worlds that are more comfortable for biology. There's the neural network involved in his work, etc. So I think it would be interesting to look at the limits of what your work is doing with regards to their work. But the more I'm hearing, to be honest, the more I'm beginning to think that maybe we really don't need church encoding at all in cognitive neuroscience in order to understand how the brain does it. But we need to work on the side of how a representation learning approach learns a generalizable family tree how to go further from the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine. And it's called Tolman-Eichenbaum machine to reference, obviously, the sort of the cognitive map and episodic memory model origination of this. Whereas we know, well, Tolman worked in rodents, so it's not that part of it is not exactly just about, it's about learning associative structures in the world in general. I am wondering, truly, whether symbolic, and this is that I haven't formulated it, I guess, this strongly before, but now I'm wondering whether there is an emergent way that we could describe what's happening in a symbolic way, but that's not necessarily what's needed in order to build a machine that does that kind of processing like the brain does. And it might be helpful at some point if you want to summarize something and communicate it in a language understandable way to other humans of what's going on. Maybe then symbolic sort of ways of transmitting it is helpful. But I wonder whether we don't need to use that in order to build a learning machine that it can afford or allow for symbolic like processing.
I mean, it seems like symbols are pretty useful because they, well, I don't know, I guess I haven't thought about this very much, but it seems like they're kind of useful abstractions for describing, regularities in the world or something. So are you saying that like you don't, like an organism should not be expected to make symbols? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying like, if you look at traffic from above, there is an emergent pattern maybe that looks like a particular kind of like stripes, but people were not making stripes. You can look at it and represent it by painting it as stripes in a painting, but that humans were like in their cars in the traffic, they weren't trying to make stripes. That was just an emergent property of it that you can represent with drawing lines. Likewise, I wonder whether there is an emergent property of the processes that brains do that can be described in a symbolic way, but we don't need it in order to build a machine that learns to do certain things. The way that the processes will do can be captured or summarized in a symbolic way. That's what I'm thinking, because at the end of the day, the brain uses certain kind of representations, connections between them, and certain algorithms on top of those representations. And by representation, I mean some neural populations are going to get active with different weights to represent or stand for different things. And then the rules are also going to be governed by certain pathways being functionally temporarily higher weights or lower weights for some time. And some operations happen because some gates might be open and closed at the same time and synchronized at the same time, and some things get integrated in a part of the brain that integrates things, or separated in a part of the brain that separates things. Translated into that kind of like more biologically, neurally plausible components. And I see that David unmuted himself, so I hope that he's going to say something on top of this. I wonder whether that's the language with which we need to build the machine, and then see how symbolically describable processes fall out. David, please take it away.
No, the one thing I wanted to say, and this is something that I know in the computational world, people love to speak in terms of weights between neurons or simulated neurons. And it's a bugbear of cellular people like me, because connections between neurons are not adequately described merely by a weight. They have dynamics, right? In other words, you can have two synapses that have the same weight, and one of them upon repeated stimulation will get larger in terms of its weight over time. Another one will get smaller in fatigue, right? So all I'm saying here, and I don't mean to, be a nudge about this, is that when we're trying to think, and wax philosophical about some of these higher level representations, whether they are church encoding or Tolman-Eichenbaum machines or whatever, and how we're trying to imagine those built into neurons.
Sorry, one second.
Thinking about neurons and connections as much more sophisticated than just a weight between two elements.
That is totally fair, but just to be clear, Tolman-Eichenbaum machine is not waxing philosophical. It's a neural network model, and it reproduces a series of experiments that were done in rodents and in humans at great detail. So it is not waxing philosophical, if anything. So, and at the same time, I understand that molecular people sometimes are not happy with the way neural networks simplify a neuron, and that's totally fair. Blake and I have argued there. I'm just going to mute the... Who is... Okay. I muted everyone to avoid the sound of the siren. But the point of having neural networks is to get a step closer to the biologically plausible versions. And they have been a very good model of neural circuits. Are they a good model down to the level of molecular sort of levels? There are some models for molecular levels. They're not necessary for the higher levels. Does that mean that this is the same category as logic? No, because we don't have a biologically plausible version of one, but we do have a neurally plausible version of the other. That in the field of cognitive neuroscience, where we don't deal with at the molecular level, we can measure things, make hypotheses, model the data, make predictions, and study it in the brain, right? But this molecular biologists, obviously, they work at a different level. So it's totally plausible that they would say, hey, but this is not exactly the brain. To which I think we should go to Zena before it gets too late. To which I think some of us simply say that it's different levels of explanation. The point is that logic at the same level of explanation as the rest of the computational fields can't capture biologically or neurally plausible approaches.
Can I respond really briefly? Yeah. No, I mean, I take, first of all, I didn't want to say that the Tolman-Eichenbaum model is waxing philosophical. I was saying our discussion is. I'm not meaning to put down the Tolman-Eichenbaum model. What I'm saying is that, I take your point that all of the minutia of cellular molecular biology is not necessarily going to inform these higher level ideas. But I'm concerned that there are aspects of it that really would, that are being ignored, right? That there are certain things that we already know about how neurons and circuits work, that the same way that our understanding of reinforcement learning was very useful to developing formalisms and neural models, that there will be aspects of what we know in the cellular world, not all things in the cellular world, but aspects of it that might conceivably enrich the way formal models are built. And
I 100% agree with you. Speaking of which, some of us have been talking about how we can incorporate different neurotransmitters, for instance. Or Blake, who had to leave earlier, he has done some work in kind of incorporating other molecular aspects into the idea of neural networks. So I'm totally in agreement with you. And I think in the future, we will do more. And I will go even a step further and say, not only would neurons and molecular level be interesting, I think even single cell organism and fungi networks would be very interesting to imitate computationally, because they're just simpler in order for us to sort of imitate them. And, they do actual, tasks that some people would consider very high level, but actually sometimes single cell organisms even can do it, or a fungal network can do very sophisticated tasks. So I'm totally with you that we need to sort of go to that level. I'm very glad now, if it's okay, to go to...
Ida, it's actually 6 o'clock and we're going to have to go in a minute. I can't believe it's 2 hours have gone by. I don't know.
Want to wait for
Zena?
Yeah.
Just
Wanna
so...
wait for Zena?
Zena, you're here, right? Zena?
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Now we can.
Cool. So yeah, thanks for the talk. I had a quick question, and it's just about the position of your paper. So I don't have a good sense of what kind of theory you're proposing. I've read the paper, like at what level. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you seem to be quite agnostic to this particular representation, combinatory logic. As Blake said, you could, or as your response to Blake, you said you could switch it out and choose something different. but at the same time, you do seem to be committing a kind of, towards this thread and towards a theory based on this. And so my high-level question is, what is fundamentally different about combinatory logic, which would substantiate this as a new kind of theory? Or is it more like a different of degree, different of kind of level, or is it a new way to think about it in a kind of fundamental sense? And just to add on to that, one thing that you said many times is emergent dynamics, right? So what this gives you is some kind of dynamics. And so, going perhaps to John's point about, sometimes we just have facts, things that we know. Does it make sense to represent just facts, through dynamics? Aren't they two different kinds of things? And do I want a theory of knowledge to be necessarily dynamical?
Yeah, cool. So those are great questions. I wouldn't say it's a new kind of theory. I'd say it's an old kind of theory. It's like, I really mean it as like it's a metaphor that logicians figured out about how systems can encode other systems, and that seems to be, to me, what neuroscience needs to encode cognitive psychology, and what cognitive psychology needs in order to translate things down into dynamical terms, which is what physical systems are. They're dynamical systems. And so it's really just meant to kind of highlight that part of history as a useful way of spanning different levels of abstraction, from dynamics all the way up to the kinds of things you want to talk about in high level concepts, right? Like procedures and logic and whatever. And so, yeah, I think with that perspective, at least for me, when I think about church encoding, it becomes less mysterious how you could have a system which is obeying both high level and low level rules, right? You can be, on a very micro level, kind of chugging through each of the S's and K's and just following their rules. You can actually do that in parallel for these kinds of representations. And each little processor, each neuron or whatever that would do that, right, would have no idea about the big picture. It would just be following its dynamics. And nonetheless, right, it's the structures it's representing are organized in a way that give rise emergently to these higher level things that people think about in cognitive psychology. Yeah.
So I agree, but is that, you contrasted it to, let's say, these high level programmatic representations, like in the start of your talk. But that's also true there. If I run a Python program, it fundamentally gets reduced down to some pretty low level operations which don't know about the high level, the cognitive feature. And so my question really is like, is it, is combinatory logic so different? Like I still need to, interpret these things, and that does actually happen in the real world on hardware. So is it more like a different kind of theory, or you want a theory which could conceivably be more brain-like in some sense? Is that
yeah.
the real difference?
Yeah, so you're totally right that it happens on a computer level, right? That thing, my CPU flipping registers around doesn't know anything about the high level processes, but it's not. It's first of all not distributed in the way that these kinds of representations can be, and it's second of all not compositional like these things, right? So. Like it's fundamentally different, I think, to work in a kind of logical system where you're thinking about encoding, fundamentally different from like just a CPU executing a program, right? Because you're really trying to build a sort of system of knowledge in church encoding, and it's true that it's it's translatable back and forth to what a CPU is doing, but it just feels to me at least like different sort of forms of analogy, right? Where the church encoding one is really about learning representations of what's going on in the world and learning them in some system which can be distributed and which has intrinsic dynamics. That's not something which is necessarily true of all computers, for example. I don't know if that makes sense, but it really is just a metaphor, I think. So, and sorry, I forgot your second question.
I forgot my second question.
Okay.
No, thank you.
There are a lot of questions in the Ask a Question area, and I have promised people that I will read them, so I'm a little anxious right now, but am I allowed to read a couple of them, or do you have a hard stop?
I should be okay. Yeah, sorry, I haven't even looked at those.
Trying
to follow all the talking.
I'll read a couple of them. So John, I think this is John Kubi. He's asking, this strikes me as a blank slate type of model. Another approach is that there are representational primitives visible in simpler animal brains that elaborate in human brains. Examples like representing objects, distances, space, movement, etc.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. I think that there's there's plenty of things that evolution has given us that help us survive. The mystery, right, is not, like, because of that, it's not a mystery that we're able to walk around the world and eat and find food and those kind of things, right? The mystery is why we're able to do these abstract computations, which may have little or no kind of evolutionary relevance at all, right? So why is it you can solve that list problem I started the talk with, right? And so whatever it is that evolution has given us, it has given us this ability to discover kind of abstract logical pieces of the world from tiny amounts of evidence. And that's what this type of stuff is meant to be a model of.
Thea asks, if there are implicitly learned rules, what is a symbol in relation to learning rules? Is a symbol emergent after having learned an implicit rule? Is a symbol developmental, logical, later than simply learning stimulus-response relations? Is a symbol emergent from compositionality and a different level of complexity?
Those are good questions. I guess I would say that at least the main thing this kind of model is trying to do is a little bit different. So it's not really trying to define what a symbol is. It's really trying to define how a symbol gets meaning. And it's saying the symbol gets meaning from its interactions with other symbols. Okay, and I'm not sure, like, philosophically what that makes a symbol exactly, right? But it's meant to say, like, the things that we think about symbolically, like logic, for instance, or numbers or family trees or whatever, they get their content, or at least part of their content, from the relationships that they participate in with other symbols and how those relationships go.
Montreal asks, would it be possible to define layers of a neural network as a sort of system of combinators, S's and K's, that function in a combinatory fashion, which itself generates representations? More of a clarifying question, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how to encode these things. But certainly it's possible to encode things that have similar dynamics, right? And I'm sure there's a variety of ways to do that. I think that the hard part, as I said, is not the encoding, because, like, there's lots of theories about how to do binary trees, and that's all you need to get combinators. The hard part is the learning, right? So figuring out an algorithm which could, take some relations or some things that observes from the world, whatever format those are, which I agree is a hard problem, and figure out how to configure its internal dynamics in order to mirror that. That's, I think, the kind of hard kind of neural net problem for this type of stuff. But I at least feel a little bit optimistic about it, because the representational side is easy. Representational side is just binary trees.
Joao Barbosa asks, how do you think the operators S and K are implemented through neural dynamics? How could we try finding evidence for it in the brain?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's S and K. The hard part of writing this kind of paper is you have to pick a formalism, I guess, and I think that the thing to investigate is people or animals' abilities to learn arbitrary processes and procedures, right? So there's something you see out in the world, you form an internal model of it. What is the language for that model? And if we could figure out a good language for a model, which S and K is, but there's 100 others, then I think we could start thinking about how organisms could form the types of abstractions and things that people use. So.
Jonathan Flowers, who's a philosopher, is our resident philosopher here, asks, how does this model of church encoding deal with novel stimuli or situations that are outside of rigidly defined contexts?
Yeah, so I guess there's two senses in which something could be novel. You could encounter a situation which is a new combination of stuff you've thought about before, right? So, you've thought about a bowling ball and you've thought about a basketball hoop, and I could ask you what would happen if you tried to throw a bowling ball up at a basketball hoop, right? And that's compositionally defined from things you already know. And church encoding should be fine with that. I mean, that situation, I guess, is more complicated than any of the ones I've been talking about. But in principle, right, like you could take some operator and apply it to some representation you have, and even though you've never put those two things together before, their internal structure in terms of their church encoding or their S's and K's and whatever determines their dynamics, and so it determines what outcome you would get from that. So you can handle novel things like that. And in the paper, actually, there's a bunch of domains where some relevant facts or interactions or something are not observed, but the pieces are observed in other contexts, right? So I show you, a material that is attracted to the positive end of a magnet, what will happen on the negative end, right? You can reason through those with combinator encodings of those domains. The other way things could be novel, though, is like you get a totally new symbol you've never seen before, and you have no idea how it interacts with anything, right? So I tell you, like, oh yeah, I'm thinking of a function f. What is f of 12, right? And you're like, I don't know. You haven't told me anything about it. I have no way of encoding it. And that's a situation, I think, where both people and these kinds of models would fail. I bring that example up, though, because we've actually done a little bit of experiments trying to test kind of people's encoding of very minimal domain contexts. So I say, look, there's a function f, and f of a is b. What is f of b?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's like, okay, that's like a kind of philosophically impossible problem to ask, right? But people have certain intuitions about what it should be. Like they think C is a pretty good answer. They think B is an okay answer. They think Q is a really bad answer. And those are kind of generalizations that you would think nothing would license. But yeah, we've been interested in modeling those kinds of things with this kind of encoding system. So
something I forgot and I skipped was Richard Lang, who was very highly voted as well. In the sense that concepts are high level and perception motor things are low level, I'm curious about how far down you think the program learning metaphor can or should be taken in the brain. In other words, to what extent do you think of fine perceptual motor learning as program inductions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I don't know. So I certainly think there are abstract things that are well described this way. There's lots of perceptual motor domains where you're probably more constrained by like what we have innately than our innate kind of bodies, right? Than this kind of program learning. On the other hand, there are areas, maybe particularly in like motor learning, where you're learning things that are a lot like programs, right? Like learning to write letters or something. That's the character writing and things are things that people have modeled as program induction, even though they're I don't know. I don't know if you call them high level or not. I don't know if you call them perceptual and motor or not. But yeah, I think that it's a good observation that the lines kind of fuzz out there somewhere. And how, for instance, an S and K kind of representation or a church encoding would interact exactly with perceptual domains is a pretty hard question to figure out, I think.
Maybe final question. Emily asks, is there a way to measure the capacity of these combinatorial functions? For instance, the maximum amount of information you can flow through a particular function.
Yeah, that's a cool idea I hadn't thought of. You could ask a question like, if I had a capacity bound, let's say I could only use 10 combinators, what is the space of things I could represent with that? It'll be some finite little corner of computable, functions or something that you can represent with those. But I don't know. I don't know that bounds in that sense have been well explored on the logical side. I'm just not sure. So
I just realized that while we were talking, 4 questions were added, but I think that's probably all the time that you have. I know that you have little ones and you probably need to go get to them. And John probably has to go to some either a hospital or a fancy party, one of those things. So, John, are you frozen?
Yeah, I'm not frozen. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I have to go. It's more about my mum, actually. It's not very glamorous. But I just wanted to say, I think that this is an example of where we could really, there are a number of iterations are needed for us to all begin to see just this is quite an ambitious architecture. It's got a lot of deep things in this, and I know we haven't fully digested it all, Steve. I hope you forgive us. But it would be nice to be able to maybe have you back or have you visit, to go through this again, because there's something very, very important here. And it does feel like it's on the right track, like you sort of say at the beginning of the paper. But I still find myself struggling between the representations that one can have before one starts to operate on them in terms of relations.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that dichotomy isn't fully collapsing in my head just yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. For example, whether one could build a machine that could predict or model the world that didn't have the relations. And that would be something interesting to think about that I don't know the answer to, right? But is there a sense in which this kind of symbolic parsing of the world is really necessary for accurately predicting it or not? Anyway, I'd be happy to come back. I'm also happy to answer questions that people email. So this is super fun, and it's really fun to have so many kind of engaged and curious, critical people. So it's great.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Fun. And thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, and join us again next week for cognitive neuroscience of sleep.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Ciao. Thanks, Ida.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Claire.